Hello out there in Radioland. This is Michael. This is the Street Preacher's Corner podcast. Um, that's all I have to say about that. Well, I have been as of late immersed, and immersed is the correct word to use, in a very specific time of church history, a very specific piece of church history, the history of black churches. I have read 6 or 7 books back to back about different aspects of the black church life, especially in the South. Um, and there's a lot more to read. And if I think about it, I'll list my sources. So if you want to go on this journey with me, you can. So what started out is I had some questions. I had some observations I had made about the black church in America in the South, and I began to wonder about myself how those things came to be, how those traditions, how those practices came to become, accept how they had their origin, and how they became so accepted in black churches. When I say black church, I don't have to stick any more adjectives on there. A image, a thing pops into your mind. You know what a black church is, and so because it has so many cultural singularities. So I began to wonder about why those things were, and began to look at where those things got their start. And like I said, I'm still digging because there is a lot, and it is very, very complicated. But as I was looking at these answers, I stumbled across some real heroes of the faith, and and so the guy I'm going to talk about today is one of those guys. And I'm not going to say, well, I can't talk about him because he's a black guy or any kind of. People have implied that maybe that history belongs to them and this other history belongs to us, and that makes zero sense. If I'm saved, then this fellow I'm going to talk about is also saved. Then we are brethren, and he is more kin to me than he is to his own kin, and that's, I don't know the way to say that. So no, if you're saved, nothing, you're not off limits, and we have a responsibility to evaluate each other in light of the scriptures and encourage each other from the scriptures, and I think this will be a great encouragement to you. Um, so Andrew Bryan is the guy I'm going to be talking about. Now, Andrew Bryan was born a slave in 1734 or 1735 or 1736 or 1737, but I don't know who you ask. He was born in Goose Creek, South Carolina, which is an area just above the South Carolina-Georgia border. Um, how do I say this? Every man is a product of his time. I think and look at the world like a 21st century human being. Even as I'm a dinosaur, I'm still not completely a dinosaur, right? I mean, I still my perspectives and my attitudes and my expectations were formed by the time in which I lived, and the same thing is true of everybody. So it's a little unfair sometimes to go back and look at people from 300 years ago, 400 years ago, and say, well, they didn't do things the way we would have done them in 2023. That's probably a true statement. But what is totally fair to do is take the life of any man at any point in history and judge it according to the Bible, because the Bible is outside of time. The Bible is timeless. So you can't judge a man by the latest social understanding of a topic, but you can judge a man according to the scriptures, and you should. You're supposed to. We're not going to stand in judgment of Andrew Bryan on the scriptures. I'm just trying to lay some groundwork here. Because, like I said, every man is a product of his time, and history does not happen in a vacuum. So, to make sense of Andrew's story, of his life story, of his ministry, we have to talk about Andrew's world, and that means we have to talk about slavery, because it is, after all, 1734 in South Carolina. So, as you probably know, African slaves began to arrive in North America in the early 1600s. Now, there's a thing called the diaspora, when the African slave trade was at its heights, and these people were shipped from West Africa to various places in the Western Hemisphere, everywhere from Canada on down to South America has the footprint of the African slave trade. And when you get into the African slave trade, man, it is a complicated subject. And what most of us have been fed is a very flat, two-dimensional understanding of it. We are fed this, especially in America, we are fed this dumbed down, watered down, cartoonish caricature of the complexity of what was really going on. We are fed this image of the beaten slave and the beating master, and certainly those things happened. Certainly those things happened. No doubt, no doubt at all that thing happened. But I'm telling you that it is really complicated. I mean, almost from the very beginning. So let me just say this. I'm going to come back to it, but almost from the very beginning, the Church of Jesus Christ went from the early 1600s in North America on to even now. The Church of Jesus Christ has really struggled with, what do we make of this? What do we think about the idea of slavery and the very peculiar way that it was implemented in America? And I say that in a very peculiar way because, like I said, these African slaves got shipped all over the Western Hemisphere, some parts of Europe, but mostly the Western Hemisphere, everywhere from Canada down to as far down into South America as you want to go. You have the remnants of the African slave trade. Um, but the way it was done in America, in the colonies, and then into the republic that eventually became, is a little bit different than the way everybody else did it. In my opinion, it was a little bit worse than the way it was done in other places. And that's really where the church has to get involved with that sort of thing. That's where the church cannot stand idly by, is because slavery is not illegal in your Bible. Neither testament prohibits you or precludes you from owning another human being. But that ownership comes with some very specific conditions, and those conditions must be met, or what you're doing is unscriptural. And if you're a Christian and you're doing something that's unscriptural, then the church has to address that. So, for example, one of the thornier elements, like I said, in the regarding slave trade, is that while slavery is legal in both testaments, in Old Testament, New Testament, man stealing is not. And the African slave trade was inescapably linked to man stealing. It still is, because it still goes on. The idea is you go and you steal this man away from it. This is not a man who sold himself to you to pay off a debt. This is not a man who you defeated in battle and he became your tribute. This is a man that you went to where he was and you stole him away from his family and from his people, and you sold him like a piece of cattle. That's banned. That's forbidden in the New Testament to be involved in man stealing. So if you were a Christian in the 1730s and you owned a slave, and you were an African slave, you were part of that process. You were part of the man stealing. You were the one that made it profitable. You owned stolen property. You had bought stolen property, and you knew it was stolen property. So that's one of the things that is peculiar to the African slave trade, is that it was involved man stealing. And one of the other things that makes it kind of a thorny issue for the church is that in most places, slaves had no legal standing. They had no legal rights. You could literally kill your slave in cold blood, and depending on where you were living, nothing would happen to you. I mean, we say, and they would say back then, we understand this is a man. This is not a dog. This is not a horse. This is a man. And yet, if you kill this man because of the conditions under which he arrived in America and the conditions under which he was purchased after he was stolen from his country, we're not going to prosecute you because that's your property. Well, you can't have it both ways. So you could literally kill the slave in cold blood. Nobody's going to suffer no repercussions. Nobody's going to come looking for you. And so that struck many Christians at the time, as fundamentally unjust. And it should have. I mean, to be honest with you, it should have, because it is. In fact, long before Andrew Bryan was born in the 1730s, Rhode Island had already outlawed slavery, and the Quakers had already banned slaveholders from church membership, because they said, "No, you're involved in man stealing. You're involved in this unjust system, and it's not right. And you cannot be in good fellowship with other Christians if you are involved in this thing." 3 years after Andrew was born, a Quaker named Benjamin Lay published a paper called "All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage." And in that paper, he called slavery a notorious sin. I mean, George Fox had already started an abolitionist movement in England to stop the slave trade because he saw it as being unscriptural for Christians to own slaves, or at least African slaves. One of the other issues in the American slave trade is that there was no consistent mechanism to free these people. You could free your slaves, but you didn't have to. Actually, in some places, in my homeland of Louisiana, it was illegal in the 1800s to free your slaves. This is wild, wild stuff. Like very, very complicated. Um, but in the Old Testament law, which is these guys would appeal to in their defense of slavery, they would say, "Look, slaves are allowed in the Old Testament." But then they did not want to live under the rules for slaves in the Old Testament. And one of the rules for slaves in the Old Testament is you had to give that fella a way out. This was not, you didn't own him and his wife and his kids and his grandkids in perpetuity. This was a thing where you would, so that was one of the problems with the American slave trade. And the church did not turn a blind eye to this. The church talked about it a bunch, and different churches took different stands in favor or against it or whatever. So while these conversations were happening, they weren't happening everywhere, and they certainly weren't happening on the banks of the Savannah River in 1734, is what I'm saying. So what you're hopefully going to see, and I know I've spent a lot of time on this, but I mean, it's a big chunk of the history. What you're going to hopefully see as we go through this is that really, if all you know about slavery is what you see on TV, you might not appreciate how thorny and complicated it really is in practice. And Andrew's story proves that, as a matter of fact, I think. So, in Andrew Bryan's world, slavery was not this appalling, consuming evil that demanded that you marshal up and raise up armies to quash it. Even in the church, some were for it and some were against it, and some really had not thought much about it. Some took the position that you could own slaves as long as you were kind to them. Some people were, like I said, firmly against it in matter of principle because of the way the slaves got here. One of the discussions that was being had by different groups of Christians is what is our obligation evangelistically to these people who not only were steeped in barbarism and paganism, but they had been brought here against their will. What is our obligation to get the gospel to them? And is the horribleness of the African slave trade an excuse or an opportunity for the gospel to get into Africa? This was a discussion that was going on. In fact, in 1701, about 30-something years before Andrew Bryan was even born, there was a group formed in London called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. And their charter says that one of the reasons they were formed was, quote, to reach the Indian and the Negro. So that was going on. There were people that were trying to get the gospel out way back from the minute that slaves started arriving. There were people that saw them as souls and wanted to reach them for Jesus Christ. So there's that. So let's get back to Andrew, though. So accounts differ as to how Andrew got the gospel. Andrew Bryan heard the gospel the first time. Most reports give credit to his conversion to a guy named George Lyle, who was a rather prominent black evangelist that was running around about the same time. And George Lyle was in Andrew's circle of people that he knew. But some say that another slave on the Bryan plantation explained the gospel to him, and he got saved. We do know that he was born again as an adult, and that George Lyle baptized Andrew. He baptized Andrew. He baptized Andrew's wife Hannah and two other slaves, Kate Hogg and Hagar Simpson. And we also know that for about 9 months after his conversion, Andrew Bryan began to preach and exhort other slaves. And he began to witness to other slaves. And he began to lead other people to the Lord on the plantation and then other places where he was around. In fact, he gathered such a crowd from people he had led to the Lord that a local white barrister named Edward Davis loaned him some property to hold meetings on. He said, "Look, I got this patch of land. You can hold meetings on it." And so Andrew and his brother Samson went out there and he cut down some rough cut logs and they built a little structure and they began to preach. They'd swap out. They'd have other preachers come in. They began to hold a little church service on this man's property. And the attendees were mostly slaves from the Bryan plantation, where they were from, or slaves from the surrounding plantation. And they began to preach. They began to draw a crowd. They began to preach to upwards of 50 or 60 people at a time in this little structure they'd built out in the middle of this guy's field. Now consider this for a moment. This man, Andrew Bryan, who was legally property, and his brother, also property, were allowed by Jonathan Bryan, their owner, their master, to assemble off-site and hold church. Also consider that his attendees, his church members, were also property, and they came from all over the surrounding area, and they also were allowed to assemble off-site, out of mind, or out of sight, or out of hearing of the masters, and hold church. Now, does that sound like the version of slavery you've been told about? Anyway, so you have all these people meeting. They're meeting on a neutral ground, so to speak, and they're assembling out of, like I said, off-site. You don't necessarily know what's going on there unless you attend. And to some people, that sounded like they were having church. And to some people, that sounded like they were plotting an insurrection and a slave rebellion. And so that's why one day an angry group of whites showed up, and they had the entire congregation arrested for plotting an insurrection. Andrew and his brother Samson were singled out because they were the ringleaders and they were the preachers, and they were, quote, beaten inhumanely. Contemporary accounts, and I've read several of them, say that with his flesh opened up and blood pooling at his feet, Andrew Bryan told his abusers that he rejoiced to be whipped and would gladly suffer death for the cause of Jesus Christ. Well, Jonathan Bryan, Andrew Bryan's owner, he heard about this. He heard about the raid. He heard that his men were taken in. He heard his men were being beaten. Keep in mind, no trial. Just, catch him, take him in place, beat him. Anyway, he found out about this, and he interceded. He actually managed to get them a hearing, which is very rare because, like I said, one of the unique issues with American slavery is that they weren't really participants in the legal system. They were sort of victims of it, or yeah. So he got them. They didn't have they don't have the right to a trial. They don't have the right to witnesses. They don't have the right to anything under the system the way it existed in Georgia and South Carolina at the time. So Jonathan Bryan, he got them a hearing scheduled with the local judge, and of course they got to stay in jail while that's happening, but at least they're going to have their day in court. And when their case finally came up, it came up before Chief Justice Osborne, and Chief Justice Osborne heard their testimony, and Chief Justice Osborne also heard the testimony of several of the surrounding plantation owners who had either attended services where Andrew was preaching, or their slaves had reported back to them of the situation that was being said. And the testimony was unanimous that Andrew Bryan was preaching the Bible. He wasn't preaching insurrection. So, if I can jump ahead just a little bit. While Andrew and Samson were in jail, awaiting their hearing, church was still going on, and a white preacher named Lorenzo Dow covered the services. The congregation of slaves took up an offering for this white man that came in and preached. Of course, he refused. But years later, Andrew Bryan ran into him again, and he gave him that money. It was like $11 or something. So that's kind of neat. But anyway, late 1700s. Like I said, history does not happen in a vacuum, and the late 1700s was a time of great revival in the colonies, in the American colonies. And that church in the barn grew and grew and grew. It was their custom, apparently, to lead folks to the Lord all year long through personal witnessing or evangelistic outreaches or whatever. They would do that all year long, and then once or twice a year, they would have a big special service. They'd bring in a special preacher, and that special preacher would baptize everybody that had gotten saved between that time. So we don't know how many people got saved during this, but we do know, because they didn't write down salvations, we do know how many people got baptized. And we know that, for example, in one special meeting in 1788, Andrew Marshall, who was a visiting preacher, Abraham Marshall, he baptized 45 of Andrew Bryan's converts in one swoop right there in the Savannah River, about an hour from where I'm sitting. So in 1790, the Jonathan Bryan, the plantation owner, he died, and ownership of Andrew passed on to Jonathan's son, William. Andrew petitioned William for for his freedom, and the church raised the necessary money, and apparently it was a very paltry amount because it was just basically the cost to file the legal paperwork to free Andrew. It was 5 shillings, I think is what it was, which winds up being like 24 cents or something. And the paperwork says, acknowledging the faithful service of my Negro Andrew, I give and grant that said Negro fellow Andrew his full and absolute manumission. So he was 53 years old when this happened. But think about this. So he had been pastor of the church for a while. And one of the peculiarities about the slave church and the black church in America at the time was everyone understood somehow that this man could be in charge of the church, but not be in charge of himself. He could have a position of authority. In fact, some of the accounts say that's the reason that there was such a growth among the church, among the blacks back then, was because it was a place where they could have some authority. It was a place they could be have some responsibility, and a place where they could. There's a lot went on with the black church back then. But anyway, it's interesting to me anyway to think about how this man could preach, could witness, could administer the Lord's Supper, could do he could oversee church discipline, he could manage the finance of the church, but he couldn't own himself. It's just different to me. So he's 53 when he's set free. And in 1790, also in 1790 was the year he got free, the church, which they called, there was a couple different names listed for it. It's called the First African Baptist Church of Savannah. Sometimes it's called the First Colored Baptist Church of Savannah. Anyway, that church was granted admission to the Georgia Baptist Association, which was mostly white churches. And by 1792, the church had 235 baptized members and another 350 that they were members but didn't have permission to be baptized. Let me back up a little bit. So when the judge turned them loose, I don't know how I missed this. When the judge turned them loose and said they could hold services, the provision was the services had to be held between sunrise and sunset. Okay, fine. That's not the end of the world. But it was decided among Andrew and his brother that they might want to meet someplace that was a little more safe than where they had been meeting at on this guy's property. So Jonathan Bryan, his owner, said, I've got a barn on this other piece of property about 3 miles from Savannah. You guys can use it there. And they met in that barn for 2 years. And I say that, I have to cover that because in 1792, the church purchased some land in downtown Savannah, and in 1794, they moved out of the barn and they went into a building. I've got a quote here, if I can find it real quick, about a guy. It's from 1792, a guy named Joseph Cook of Esau. This is his assessment of Andrew Bryan. His gifts are small, but he is clear in the grand doctrines of the gospel. I believe him to be truly pious, and he has been the instrument of doing more good among the poor slaves than all the learned doctors in America. So that's a good testimony to have. Now, so they purchase land, they move out of the barn, they're meeting at this place, and the idea was that once the church got to a certain size, Andrew wanted it to split off and form a second church, and then when that church got big enough, a third church, and so on and so forth. In this church, this First African Baptist Church of Savannah, with their slave pastor and their mostly slave congregants, sent missionaries, some of whom they purchased, by the way. They would purchase a slave and commission him to go take the gospel, and they would send him down the road. And he belonged, presumably, to the church. Sent missionaries all over Georgia and South Carolina and Virginia. And so in 1794, the same year that they left the barn and moved into their building, they formed the Lower District Baptist Association and eventually grew to split off to form the Second African Baptist Church of Savannah. Now, remember how I told you that American slavery was complicated? I mean, nobody thought it was unusual what was going on. This was happening all over the South, all over the Northeast. Slaves were pastors of churches, and slaves were missionaries, and slaves were traveling evangelists. So here we have a man, Andrew Bryan, who builds a thriving ministry while being the bought and paid for property of another man. And like I said, nobody considered this unusual. When that man died, Andrew wasn't freed; he was transferred, like a car title or something. Wait, there's more. When the Second African Baptist Church got too big, like I said, the plan was always to split off and split off and split off. They formed the Third African Baptist Church, and the Third African Baptist Church needed a pastor. And so what did they do? They bought one. They bought a slave to be the pastor. After a while, they'd set him free, but they bought a slave. But wait, it gets even more complicated than that. See this idea that everybody was longing for freedom, and maybe they were, and the idea that everybody understood really the full implications of what they were doing. No, not really. Consider this, though. In 1800, when he was 63 years old, thereabouts, Andrew Bryan sent a letter to Dr. John Rippon. If you don't know who John Rippon was a famous publisher of hymn books in England. Almost every hymn book you have right now, the collections of songs in there, those were collected and gathered up by John Rippon. He's a big deal in the hymn publishing world back in the day. Anyway, in 1800, Andrew Bryan, this slave pastor in Savannah, Georgia, writes a letter. He apparently was a correspondent with some of the great leading ministers of the day and people that were involved in different aspects of ministry on an international scale. He was corresponding with these fellows. He wrote a letter to Mr. Rippon, and I have to find this letter. Here it is. With much pleasure, I inform you, dear sir, that I enjoy good health and am strong of body, though 63 years old, and I am blessed with a pious wife whose freedom I have obtained, and an only daughter and child who is married to a free man, though she, and consequently under our laws, her 7 children, 5 sons and 2 daughters, are slaves. By a kind providence, I am well provided for, though I have had very little given to me as a minister, having a house and a lot in this city, besides the land on which several buildings stand, for which I receive a small rent, and 56 acres of land with all the necessary buildings, 4 miles in the country, and 8 slaves, for whose education and happiness I am enabled through mercy to provide. So the freed slave and the gospel preacher was a slave owner himself. And in his correspondence with other successful ministry leaders across the pond there, he pointed to his ownership of slaves as an example of his prosperity and the way God had blessed him. I wonder if Andrew Bryan ever preached out of out of Colossians 3. Just a thought. So in 1812, our friend, Brother Andrew, he died. Went the way of all flesh. And when he died, between the 3 African Baptist churches, there were over 1,500 members. And you got to understand that Savannah was not a big place, but Savannah's not a huge place now. But Savannah was not a big place. So if you'd have 3 black churches running that are running 1,500 people, man, that's a thing. That's a thing. When he died, he was surprisingly honored by the other Christians in the area, other well-respected, prominent businessmen and prominent ministers in the area. The Savannah Baptist Association, which was a white group of white churches, they said, quote, "The association is sensibly affected by the death of the Reverend Andrew Bryan, a man of color and pastor of the first colored church in Savannah. This son of Africa, after suffering inexpressible persecution in the cause of divine master, was at length permitted to discharge the duties of the ministry among his colored friends in peace and quiet, hundreds of whom, through his instrumentality, were brought to a knowledge of the truth as it is in Christ Jesus. He closed his extensively useful and amazingly luminous course in the lively exercise of faith and the joyful hope of a happy immortality." When he died, his funeral was attended by over 5,000 people, folks. In a town, there might not have been 500,000 people in the entire state of Georgia. And this one black fella, this one black soul winner, this one black preacher had 5,000 people at his funeral. The address at his funeral was delivered by the Reverend Johnson of the Baptist Association and Dr. Killock of the Presbyterian Church of Savannah, both very prominent, well-heeled, well-established fellows. They came out to honor this slave preacher. So I say all this to say this. I actually haven't come up with a really great closer for this, so we're just going to do this off the cuff. It is amazing to me to see, when I go through the story of Andrew Bryan, that a man can accomplish things for Jesus Christ under arduous circumstances because he had committed himself to do such a thing. And it amazes me that that they saw his servitude, they saw his bondage, they saw his slavery, not as the defining trait of who he was, but just one element of who he was. He wasn't primarily a slave, he was primarily a Christian. And to whatever degree God allowed him liberty to do something, he did it. And when the time came to be arrested and to be beaten and to be persecuted, he took it. And he wasn't a victim, and he wasn't a crybaby, and he wasn't somebody, oh, poor me, this is going on, that's going on. He was a hero. He was a hero of the faith. And it looks like he worked hard all his life to take his people who had been brought here against their will, and for whom freedom was a way off thing still. He did his best to teach those people about the liberty that's found in Jesus Christ. And when the dust settled, he earned the respect of other men in the ministry. He earned the respect of the church. Died with his boots on, and in his death, they honored him as a man of God, and as a man, and they treated him as if he was an equal. So, like I said, way more complicated than you've probably been told. And I think we ought to celebrate guys like Andrew Bryan. And there's a bunch more we're going to get to before it's all over with, because I've got a ton of material on black churches right now. I've got a bunch of it. So, and a bunch more to come. And man, there's a thing that happens in the 20s that I don't know what to make of it. But I think it got us to where we are now. Anyway, before I go off on another tangent, thank you for listening, all four of you. This is Michael. This is the Street Preacher's Corner podcast. And as always, I will see you on the other side.